When the Trickstar cards first came to the TCG, several players thought to add cards like Gift of Greed into the strategy. The surface level analysis of that idea was that your opponent takes damage if you have Lycris on the board and they draw cards, therefore you should play cards that give them more draws to inflict that damage. However, most competitive players quickly realize that this is a terrible idea, because while the cards technically synergize and that your opponent takes damage for drawing those cards, giving your opponent 2 free draws is not worth really any amount of damage that you're going to do to them that Konami would print on a card. However, when people see 2 cards that might have some synergy, they want to put them in the same deck, and even though most competitive players aren't using those types of combos, a lot of more table 500 players or casual players might think they're pretty good. I've even still seen people in 2019 playing those types of cards in a Trickstar deck just because, yes, they're at the lower tables, and yes, they read those cards, but just because they think they go together, and in some ways they actually do. This is what I call a surface level analysis, because you're only looking at one very specific situation, one very specific synergy, and not really getting the big picture of what makes certain cards better than others. And I've spent a lot of time talking about this theory. I think it's really important when you're going from a casual to a competitive player to understand why surface level analysis isn't all there is to the game. You need to address how good a card is when you don't have a good hand, or how good a card is when your opponent goes first and sets up a board, how good a card is in a variety of situations before you consider adding it to your strategy. I mention this because a couple days ago I posted that video about the Seal of Orichalcos, and while I did expect some sort of funny comments, and this isn't a commenters don't understand video, I didn't really expect one type of comment that I got a whole bunch of, and that's that people were suggesting to play the card in some decks that I really didn't feel made any sense at all. I understand where they were coming from in a surface level analysis situation, but I really thought that the people that were leaving these comments, at first I thought they were joking, but as I got more and more of them, I thought, oh my god, people actually think you should play Seal of Orichalcos in Monarchs. And to a lot of people you're going, well, what do you mean? Why would anyone ever suggest to play that card in a Monarch deck? However, if you're one of the people that left that comment, that's okay. I mean, I understand where you're coming from a fundamental level, but in today's video I want to talk about, once again, surface level analysis, but specifically related to Seal of Orichalcos and some of the worst suggestions that I saw on that video, starting off with Monarchs. But where did people even come up with this idea to play Seal in a Monarch strategy? After all, we have hundreds of Monarch decks to look at that were topping events, and not a single one played Seal of Orichalcos for a good reason. Well, the surface level analysis, and we think back to that Trickstar and Gift of Greed situation, is that people realize that Monarchs don't use the extra deck, and because Seal of Orichalcos shuts you off of your extra deck, they were thinking, well, this is a natural inclusion. Play a card that prevents you from going into the extra deck in a deck that doesn't need the extra deck in the first place. However, if you even took just a few seconds or a few minutes to think a little bit further than that one very specific synergy that kind of exists, you'd quickly realize that the 2 cards, or the card and the deck, really have no synergy beyond that. In fact, I would even go as far as to say that playing Seal of Orichalcos in a Monarch strategy will actively hurt your chances of seeing any forms of success. The big problem here is that Monarchs already have a field spell that is much better than Seal of Orichalcos. You get an 800 boost, and while it isn't always and isn't for all of your monsters, it will go on a lot of them, especially if you're not playing with the extra deck. But more importantly, the reason Monarchs don't play an extra deck a lot of the time is because of their field spell. So if you play no extra deck, you're playing Domain in your deck, and you probably don't want to then on top of that play Seal of Orichalcos, because if you have the Seal, you can't have the Domain and vice versa, and that doesn't seem like a lot of synergy to me. Even further than that though, the whole point of not playing an extra deck is that when you put Domain on the board, your opponent isn't allowed to summon monsters from their extra deck. That's the entire strategy of Domain Monarchs, and yet I still got several comments, probably about 20 comments from people suggesting to play Seal of Orichalcos in Domain Monarchs. And I don't know, this just really surprised me. Never in a million years did I think that Monarchs, specifically the Domain variant, would be the deck that people were suggesting to play Seal of Orichalcos in, because they so very clearly do not go together. You can't play Seal of Orichalcos in a deck that wants to play a much better field spell. It just doesn't make any sense. Seal of Orichalcos Orichalcos just gives you that 500 boost, no real other benefits for most decks out there, but on top of that, you also have a ton of downsides. You can't summon from the extra deck. It destroys all special summon monsters on your side of the field when you activate it. You can only use it once per duel. All of these restrictions added on top of a card that already isn't that good. Why would you ever play that in a deck that has a much better field spell that's searchable and has actual internal synergy with the rest of the archetype? It just kind of blew my mind when I read those comments. But oh wait, it goes even further than that, because it wasn't just Monarchs that people were saying to play Seal of Orichalcos in. A lot of other people said, why don't you play it in True Dracos? This was sort of along the same mindset of Monarchs, where people are saying, well, True Dracos oftentimes do not play an extra deck, so why not play Seal of Orichalcos? It makes perfect sense. Once again, though, these synergies actually stop right there. Just because a deck doesn't play an extra deck doesn't mean you automatically should play Seal of Orichalcos. Obviously, in the case of decks like Stun, it kind of makes sense just as a one-of that you sometimes draw, but when you look at True Dracos, just like Monarchs, once again, you find a much better field spell, so why would you ever play Seal of Orichalcos on top of Dragonic Diagram? Dragonic Diagram doesn't give a 500 attack boost, it does give a 300 attack and defense boost, and also protects your monsters from being destroyed once per turn. That's pretty cool, but more importantly, it searches a card every single turn, and once again has internal synergies with many of the True Dracos spells, traps, and monsters by destroying them and triggering things like Heritage or Disciples. Why would you ever play Seal of Orichalcos in, once again, a deck that admittedly does not use the extra deck, but has their very own archetypal field spell that you really want to draw? If you don't draw Dragonic Diagram when you're playing True Dracos, you're at a huge disadvantage, so why in the world would you ever play a much worse field spell? It just doesn't make any sense to me, and I don't really understand those comments much further than, I mean, I guess I understand the very initial thought of someone saying, well, wait a second, this deck doesn't have an extra deck, so you might as well play this card. Please, when you're thinking of adding cards to your decks, when you're thinking of playing decks in general, you have to go one step further than just thinking of one single synergy that might exist. There are always other options available. There are thousands of cards in this game. You can't just look at single synergies and try to put cards in decks where they really don't belong. Of course, as always, you're allowed to put whatever cards in your deck that you want. If you want to play the Seal of Orichalcos in your deck, sure, go ahead. That sounds great. However, I would say in this case, which is different from a lot of other cases, it is objectively wrong and terrible to play Seal of Orichalcos in your Monarch or True Draco strategy. A lot of times cards can be subjectively analyzed. You can say, well, maybe for some people they work in their decks, maybe for some people they don't. Maybe if the format changes, this card suddenly gets a lot better. But in the case of Seal of Orichalcos in decks that don't have extra decks but do have a very critical field spell, it is objectively wrong to play that card in your deck. You are only hurting your chances of winning, and while I'm sure some people will say, well, what if I just play it for the meme status? Well, that's a different discussion entirely. We don't really talk about that sort of trolling aspect of that some people like to do when they build their decks. When they build their decks in a poor way and then defend them by saying, well, I'm just trolling people with these strategies. That's not really what we discuss on this channel. That's not really what people come here for. If you're trying to play a more competitive version of admittedly a pretty casual strategy, not a lot of people are playing Monarchs, don't make it even worse by playing a bad field spell that actually has a ton of negative synergy with the cards that your deck is trying to play. So what did we learn in this video? Well, these are some of the things that I've talked about in the past, but basically when you look at a card, when you look at an interaction, you have to think about it in more than just one way. Cards can be analyzed in so many different ways and so many different aspects. I haven't even covered all the ways that you can look at a card on this channel. Everyone has their own personal tastes when it comes to what makes a card good in their particular strategies, but sometimes you really just have to go just one step further and realize, okay, even if I think about this for just a few minutes and I think of a couple interactions, maybe just do a couple test hands, you'll very quickly realize that, yeah, things like Seal of Orichalcos shouldn't go in decks like Monarchs or True Dracos. There are definitely discussions that are up for debate on my channel. Not everything is set in stone. However, in this case, to me personally and to many players, thousands of players, it seems like such an obvious thing not to do that I really question someone that suggests putting that in their Monarch or True Draco deck. And I just want to say, if you were one of the people that suggested Seal of Orichalcos in Monarchs or True Dracos or whatever, that's not necessarily bad. Not everyone knows about every single card and every single interaction, but if you're someone that considers yourself a more casual competitive player and you suggested that, I would highly recommend checking out other videos online and sort of learning about how you can better analyze cards. I don't think it's that crazy to say that Plain Seal of Orichalcos is really bad in Monarchs, and yet the comments that I got would suggest that a lot of people just don't even really look at cards more so than just one synergy that they can find between one card and another card. That's not good, and it can definitely hurt your chances of seeing any form of success in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh!, which admittedly not everyone cares about. But if you do care about that, it definitely is important to look at the surface level analysis and learn how to not do it when you look at cards or decks. Anyway though, I'll see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.